the next speaker, who really doesn't need any introduction. It's Diana Miles, and the CEO for the Law Society. And I just want to make the point that Diana, needing no introduction, I always get a charge out of this. Diana comes from a very small little, used to be a backwater community here in Grey County. And she's done an absolutely awesome job of making good use of her skills. And I won't say where she is from in Grey County, but it's a really tiny little town. And I'll leave it at that. Diana Miles, thank you.
Thank you, Jane. I really appreciate everyone's time today. I'm just going to share my screen with you so that I can give you some information today. Let's see if I can do that. There we go. Hopefully you can all see that in front of you. Maybe just give me a wave, Bill, that we're good to go. Excellent. Okay, so thank you all so much for allowing me the time to chat with you today. I just want to highlight for you a few key longer-term trends in our day-to-day activities of monitoring and regulating licensees, and then talk to you a little bit about some of our pandemic-specific activities and outcomes so that you have an indication of what we've been seeing in the midst of this rather unusual situation. So let me just start with a quick recap and a review of the status of the professions, and just look at the growth in the numbers of our licensees so you have an understanding of what we're working with every day here at the Law Society. And what I can tell you as you see these numbers is that we have not, contrary to what some might be saying, seen any drop in the number of licensed lawyers in particular in 2020. Despite the challenges of the current COVID environment, licensees are still maintaining their licenses. So by the numbers right now, we're a little over 57,000 lawyers licensed and a little over 9,600 paralegals licensed. We've seen about a 40% growth in the number of lawyer licensees in the past 10 years in Ontario. And not surprisingly, given the short time frame for paralegals of regulation, only a decade or so, we've seen a 300% growth since inception of oversight of this profession. The results are overall an increase in licensee headcount at the Law Society of 50% in the past 10 years. And growth in the number of firms shows the same sort of steep upward curve too. 11,400 plus law firms as of last month, actually. That's a 32% increase in firms in the past decade. 17% just in the past 5 years. So fairly evenly distributed annual growth and trend line there for our lawyers. We have just under 1,800 paralegal firms right now. That's about a 110% increase in the number of actual firms in a decade. Again, not surprising, it's a new profession. But note that of that increase, only 12% growth in the last 5 years, so lower than the lawyers. And once again, just by the numbers, but this time only those licensees who are practicing in private firm settings. And that, of course, is the core of our regulatory work. And it is relevant to future discussions about regulating firms. These numbers here, the number of firms for lawyers, represent a little over 28,000 practicing lawyers in 2019. So these are individuals who are practicing in private firm settings. So we have sole practitioners who make up about 1/3 of the practicing lawyers. And you'll see that they've seen about a 28% growth in the past 10 years. We have significant firm growth in the small and 6 to 10 categories, so the 2 to 5 and 6 to 10 as well. And while the percentage increases in growth in some of the larger categories, the 26 to 50 lawyers, the 51 to 100 lawyers, is actually quite high, 70%, 75%, the real growth is somewhat inconsequential, particularly from a regulatory perspective, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. These are 2019 numbers, so we also know that we've called to the bar an additional over 2,000 lawyers already this year in 2020, despite the pandemic, and we are waiting to see what their statuses will end up being, either as practicing and then in what type of practice we're not practicing. And given that we moved to administrative calls only a few months ago, this is going to take some time to hear from our new licensees. And again, more on that in a moment. So on new licensees, what are we seeing in those trend lines? But you can see here at the top of this particular slide, a slight ebb in the addition of lawyers for us from 2016 to 2018, just slightly lower in the maroon color that you see there. And now we're seeing the total inching up again, but not too dramatically. But at the end of the day, this is a significant number of newly licensed legal professions that we're adding every year nonetheless. So in 2019, we welcomed almost 3,500 new lawyers and paralegals to our ranks in Ontario. And we're continuing to see steady increases in lawyer entrants, about 14% over the past 5 years, so just under 3% per annum on average. And this has been steady for well over a decade now. And more Canadian law schools are coming on board, of course. So Ryerson, for example, and that's going to take these numbers up in a few years. I have an interesting info set for you here graphically on the bottom of this slide as well, related to the first 5 to 6 years of practice. We often speak anecdotally about how members of our professions seem to be determining in their first 5 years or so of practice that perhaps they aren't as enamored of the whole thing as they thought they might be originally. So we did track those entering licensees to get a snapshot of their trajectory. And movement out of the private practice and into other legal or non-legal environments of employment in the first 5 years really does play out. It's not just anecdotal. So if you look at these stats, for lawyers, after 5 years, only 51% are still in private practice, and a quarter of them aren't practicing at all. And for paralegals, a full 77% are no longer practicing after 5 years, even in this short decade of regulation. And that's a very significant retrenching by this group. Only 17% of paralegals are still in private practice after 5 years. So let's just focus a little bit on the first 5 years, the last 5 years, and the type of practice preferences that we are seeing the lawyer profession actually selecting. So you'll see here in front of you 6 years of data, and it represents 5 complete years of change. So as you watch the trend line, not much for lawyers really. It's increasing incrementally in growth along the chart, slow and steady in all categories. And there are 3 fee categories. We have those who pay the full fee, the 100%. They provide legal advice in their roles. So they might be in private practice in a law firm, but they also might be practicing with government or in-house counsel, but they are providing legal advice and service to their employer or to clients. That group has increased 15% in the past 5 years. What we are seeing an increase in is the percentage of lawyers in that category who wish to practice law, but in environments other than in private law firms. So they're choosing to veer away from private practice and instead go into business environments as in-house counsel or as government lawyers or in other activities. This is the single largest growth area for lawyers right now, practicing in an environment other than a private law firm. So whereas there's a 15% increase across this entire category, if you just take those who are practicing law with corporations or with government, there's a 26% increase in that category over the last decade. So another trend to monitor, because these folks are not a significant regulatory risk for us at the Law Society. Then we also have those who do not provide advice to clients and they're working in other roles. So they may have moved on to do business roles or in management or academia. They're continuing to grow by about 10.5%. So lots of interest in being trained and being licensed, but then choosing to apply their legal practice skills differently. And those who are not currently employed, of course, this would include leaves of absence or those not employed right now, but they'd like to maintain their standing with us. It's a healthy and fairly steady 5.5%. So let's just take a look at some other results. I'd like to just focus a bit on complaints that come into us and move through our process so that you have an idea of what we're looking at right now. We start with the fact that we get about 6,000 complaints annually a year about licensees. And of those, some will be outside of our jurisdiction and we'll just close them. And some others are readily remediated at this early stage and can also be closed. We spend a substantial amount of time in our complaints and compliance area of the Law Society doing as much of that as we possibly can, remediating and closing, in order to streamline and provide our complainants with timely and quality client service by bringing their issues to closure with the licensee if we can do that at all possible. But sometimes that doesn't work. So we have many complaints that move up the ladder, and the percentages for these transfers have remained quite stable for many years. Of the 6,000 complaints that we receive annually in 2019, and that's what these numbers represent, just under 4,400 had to be sent to the Professional Regulation Department to receive a more in-depth review and treatment. Again, at this stage, our intake and resolution team of professionals really work hard to respond to the complainant. They bring the complainant and the practitioner together to come to a resolution if possible and close that file. Once that's completed, about 75% of our complaints are closed. About 25% will move forward to an investigation because they've been found to have serious consequences and have caused harm and require much more significant review and interactions with the licensee. Of those investigations, slightly over 75% will once again eventually be closed because it's been resolved, we've managed the issue with the complainant and the licensee, or there isn't enough evidence for the matter to be found. At the end of the day, about 6% of the original complaints into professional regulation out of the 4,400 are actually sent through the discipline area for a workup for the potential issuance of a notice of hearing. So that's our operational regulatory complaints numbers. Now, one more thing on this matter, I want to look at the profile of licensees with you who are the subject of complaints and eventually the subject of notices of discipline. I want to review those results by our most significant and key indicator when we consider predictors of risk, and that's firm size. There's one item in both the lawyer and paralegal outcomes that is for the Law Society statistically significant due to its very high and consistent probability. And we see that it is only sole practitioners where the percentage of complaints and notices is higher than their representation in the professions for both lawyers and paralegals. So for small lawyer firms, complaints percentages might also be slightly higher than their population, but not the notices for hearing. So that's good news. For paralegals, it's also mostly restricted to the solo environment. But for all sizes of firms, the percentages of complaints and notices are much lower than the lawyer or paralegal percentage represented within those categories, except for the soles. So whereas 1 out of every 3 lawyers designate as practicing individually or as a solo practitioner, they actually represent 9 out of every 10 of our notices issued for discipline. And where 1 out of 2 paralegals designate that their individual practitioners are solo, they also represent 9 out of every 10 notices for discipline. So there are many data points that we look at the Law Society every day in our operations that assist us to understand the circumstances and the demographics of where we're seeing increased risk in our regulatory environment, where you're seeing increased risk in your practice environments. And that provides us with some direction to consider how we're going to apply our resources, when we're going to do that, to what extent we should be doing that, and how it might be best to do so. We use all of this information to modify operations and ensure that we're being responsive and to propose policy changes or program changes, if that's appropriate, to evolving our approach as a regulatory authority. So I'm going to leave it there on the general update for what we're seeing across the professions right now, just related to key regulatory considerations. And I'd actually like to move on to talk a little bit more specifically about the Law Society's pandemic responses and how the Society has been focusing on its work and has pivoted to ensure that we're in a position to continue to fulfill our legislative mandate in this unique and challenging time, and also assist all of you and your members. So like all large organizations, we were required to move quickly to establish our emergency response. We transitioned in 2 days to a full work at home situation. We had no downtime in any of our regulatory activities at all. Our call service center continued to take calls from the public and licensees, as did all of our other support centers. And we also engaged, as did Fola and others, in justice sector check-ins and planning, providing support and assistance and communications on behalf of the courts in particular to keep our licensees up to date. As you know, we also addressed an annual fee deferral and annual report filing deferrals for those licensees who had yet to pay their fees or file their annual reports by the end of March, deferring those to June and then again deferring them to mid-August. We have since completed the requirement for the payment of fees and the filing of annual reports, given that the deferrals were addressing those that had failed to file or pay by the required deadlines, and everyone else had already completed their filings and their payments. We also assisted the courts and justice partners by establishing an emergency family law referral line and connecting self-represented litigants with family lawyers to address urgent matters and keep things moving as best as possible, particularly in the early days of the pandemic when virtual hearings were only just being considered. We had that up and running with the help of our partners like yourselves within 9 days following the declaration of the emergency, and we've facilitated well over 1,600 interactions since that time, involving 3,200 contacts with family law lawyers across the province. The Law Society also embraced the reality that the pandemic presented an opportunity to consider burden reduction and administrative streamlining relating to our licensees and our engagement with you. And for instance, in our client service areas, we moved important forms and filings to electronic formats. We accepted documents electronically and introduced digital signatures and other improvements that will now remain as permanent features. More generally, on the client services front, client service risk and reputational risk for the legal professions is an important consideration for us as the Law Society and the regulator. The need to be responsive and timely to the public and our licensees is, of course, critical to us. We receive over 150,000 calls in our client service center annually, and that's not including other calls received into other areas of support in the Law Society. Annually, we manage well over 350,000 interactions with the public and licensees. Our answer rates and our training for our staff to ensure proper interactions is critical to our reputation, and this includes managing difficult conversations and complex personalities who contact us. And as you can imagine, this was exacerbated during the past few stressful pandemic months. And policy development at the Law Society never stops when you're a regulatory authority. So a few highlights of key activities that occurred in the policy area specific to COVID in particular include moving to support licensees in their application of remote commissioning and notarizing, working with the ministry on power of attorney amendments and estates law reform activities, also developing COVID frequently asked questions, which I'll mention again in more detail, and also engage in check-ins with our licensees to determine pain points and challenges so that we could assist and create resources and supports where it was feasible for us as the regulator to do so. And communications are also critical during this time, as we all know. And Fola and the local law associations did an absolutely superb job of engaging with their memberships during this time. At the Law Society, we saw a significant increase in activity on our website with over 1 million page views from March to August just related to our COVID-19 pages, and significantly increased unique views and unique visitors to the site as compared to 2019, also during that time period. We engaged in weekly updates to keep our licensees apprised of important pandemic information and all the changes that were happening. And not surprisingly, we did have an increased open rate for those communications when we were all looking for critical information on next steps in the profession, which had been declared an essential service. The next few slides, I'm going to just outline for you some more of our comparative numbers for activities that were undertaken from mid-March through the end of August. I've provided you in the next slides activity levels for this year between March and the end of August, but also for 2019 so that you can see the comparative for the same time period last year. They give you a good indication of the fact that activity and interactions at the Law Society didn't stop, nor could they, because they related to critical areas of our licensee regulation that had to continue regardless of the pandemic. So here in licensing, we see that the numbers have continued, and albeit we had some very quick and effective pivots and processes and protocols that had to change. With the number of lawyers called to the bar and the number of licensing examinations that were held during this time actually higher than the year before in the same period, despite the pandemic. I've set out for you here in the next few slides a list of the various changes that had to take place in order to effect these course corrections to licensing. And they weren't little pivots. They were very significant and complicated changes, many of which had to be approved by the board before we could actually engage in them. Everything from moving to administrative calls to make sure that these candidates had a quick and effective means to become licensed and begin working, right through to e-filing and virtual commissioning of all of our licensing documentation. And of course, you will probably have heard about our quick transition to online licensing exams to ensure that these candidates could complete their licensing in a timely way. So we went from large venue, in-person, 1,500 to 2,000 candidate in a room exams to completely and fully online with live proctored examinations in less than 10 weeks, which was quite a feat. We've been looking at online exams for a while, but never did we expect to have to do that in less than 3 months. And the results have actually been quite excellent, very stable, quite efficient, and supportive of those candidates who were no doubt stressed by the concerns of how they were going to be able to move forward. And items that will undoubtedly also have affected some of you and your law firm protocols, we did make changes to the articling term, going from 10 months down to 8 months. We implemented protocols for remote placements, and we revised recruitment procedures and training plans to support online administration, among other items. Just a bit about moving forward with quality assurance activities and how we're going to be moving ahead in this area. Quality assurance, of course, are our spot audits and our practice management reviews and other activities. And they are a regulator's methodology for checking on key practice risks for changes in behaviors, which may be predictive of inadvertent or active misconduct or potentially lead to future misconduct. So we like to get out ahead and in front of those potential risks. An important gauge of the conduct of our licensees is this activity, and even more so in a situation when we're all challenged by the economic impacts and lawyers are finding it difficult in some practice areas to continue their work at previous client and case levels. It's exactly in these circumstances when licensees may succumb to cutting corners or engaging in less than appropriate conduct as they do their work for their clients. Our quality assurance protocols affirm the ability of the practitioner to ably and without causing harm serve their clients. And this is a directed, risk-based form of proactive regulation that the Law Society has been actively engaged in for at least 2 decades. We've moved now in this area to new remote audit and review protocols, spending the early months of the pandemic revising our protocols and all of our risk criteria and testing audits and reviews. And we're now going to be moving forward to apply those as a more regular activity, still maintaining fulfillment of our mandate in the public interest, but also reducing regulatory burdens for those who are selected to be audited or reviewed. In our practice supports and resources area, we found ourselves busier than ever during the pandemic. We saw a significant increase in the number of calls to the helpline, and we also assisted both our own organization, other organizations, and our licensees by developing 43 different COVID-specific frequently asked questions covering 14 practice management topics, 10 banking technology-related issues, some practice guides, and also checklists. And we also updated everything else we have available at the Law Society to ensure that those supports were COVID relevant and supported the immediate needs of all of our licensees. And that included this list of new resources and regular updates that I'm showing you here. I commend this for you in your memberships. And this slide deck, by the way, is posted on the Fola page for later. And so if you have any members who are looking for specific assistance or direction, they can certainly turn to these documents and most certainly give the practice management helpline a call. And education did not stop either. Licensees were very interested in receiving information about the pandemic, of course, and its impacts, and also practice advice from their colleagues on how to manage everything from remote notarization right through to mental health needs. So you'll see here that while we held fewer paid programs during the March to August period, we also held a variety of free programs to support licensees during this time. We had a resounding attendance of over 27,000 people for those programs. We also opened up a long list of previously offered programs, all for free for licensees to continue to learn, engage, and meet their training needs. And that accounted for another 17,000 attendances, so very busy. And our CPD team quickly moved to offer COVID-specific education, turning out their first new program 11 days after the declaration of the emergency state. So one more item for me, and then I'll close down for you. Just a quick reality check. I feel somewhat obliged to do this as the regulator. The pandemic, as we know, got in the way of just about everything for all of us. Unfortunately, it did not get in the way of complaints against lawyers and paralegals. Our comparative numbers are showing that levels of complaints against legal practitioners remain steady throughout the pandemic. They continue to be steady. This chart goes to August, and I can tell you for September and October, the complaints numbers have increased, not decreased. So nothing ever stops, and we do have to address those activities. Final comments for today. There is no doubt that this pandemic will indelibly change the way that all businesses do their work, and the Law Society is no exception. We have been impacted by this health crisis as a profession, and as a regulator, we do understand the need to be responsive to the longer-term impacts of this situation. The Law Society moved quickly to consider administrative and policy changes that will reduce burdens for licensees in their interactions with us. My team and I, my management team, have led a review of a variety of different administrative and policy activities in order to assist our board to make changes and revisions that will proactively reduce burdens for all of us. And Convocation is approving those series of changes, and they'll be implemented in the coming year. So excellent news for all of us. We've also, as an organization, reduced our employee complement by over 10%. This has had an impact on our priorities, on our services, and our service standards. And as you will no doubt understand, with many of you being business owners, it's had an impact on morale as well. Our team, like your teams, strive to do the best job possible, and they are dedicated to the mandate of the Law Society as a legal regulator in the public interest. And it is very challenging and difficult to have to address such changes. I'm very proud of our team at the Law Society, all of whom have been very dedicated to serving the public and licensees during a very difficult period of change for us. The new normal at the Law Society is going to continue to see changes. We already have, and we're going to continue to redefine our workflow and how we support all of you and deal with those of us in our profession who may be failing in professional obligations and could potentially be causing harm to clients. We're looking to reassess risk criteria and response levels in a way that fulfill our mandate, but realistically reduce burdens for licensees and for our own operations internally. And as an organization, we're going to continue to reconsider how we work and how we will move forward. And we'll do so with a focus on developing policies and protocols that will address the future of the professions and also promote evolution. The pandemic has certainly caused everyone to step back and take a moment to consider how to approach that future. For the Law Society, this will range from the need to remove or redefine our current services and supports through to recreating our regulatory activities and addressing levels of risk response. We'll be addressing new modalities of interaction that will hopefully reduce burdens for our licensees and develop effective and efficient regulatory platforms that will sustain our mandate as a profession-based regulator that must act in the public interest and is required to focus on ensuring that we control harms against the public. And please do ensure that your members in your local associations remember that the Law Society is able to assist in a number of ways in this strange and ever-changing environment, whether that's to answer a question about ethical issues, provide educational materials, respond to mental health needs, or assist the lawyers to manage unfortunate health crises and the closure of practices. I'm not going to be taking questions today because sometimes it gets a little complicated, but I did want to make sure that I provided you with my contact information. I'm always happy to hear from any and all of you at any time, so please feel free to reach out. I hope that you and your families will be safe and healthy as we all continue to navigate this unusual set of circumstances. And I will turn it over now to Bill to lead you through the next part of your session.
Thank you very much, Diana. We appreciate you spending the time with us this morning and giving us the update.